I can't sleep because every night the thin walls reveal sounds that shouldn't exist. I had no idea what I was getting myself into when I moved into this apartment. It seemed perfect at first. A small place on the edge of the city. Quiet, affordable, and conveniently close to work. I was tired of the constant noise from roommates, tired of sharing space, and just needed somewhere I could breathe. At first, everything was fine. A new place, a fresh start. But over time, something started to feel off. It wasn't the apartment itself, but the atmosphere. After a few weeks, I began to hear strange noises, always at night. At first, it was faint. The odd creak of the floorboards, the hum of the pipes. But they kept coming back, and they always came at night, when everything was still and silent. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing more than the house settling, or maybe the neighbors. But as the days passed, the sounds began to change. They were no longer just random noises. They were human. It started with whispers, soft, low voices, barely audible through the thin walls. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Maybe it was just the wind or the neighbors talking in another room. But as the days passed, the whispers grew clearer. They weren't just idle conversations. They sounded like arguments. I could catch snatches of words, harsh tones, cutting off mid-sentence. It was strange, too strange. I would lie in bed, my eyes wide open in the dark, holding my breath, trying to understand what I was hearing. Was it the neighbors? But the walls were thin, right? Couldn't they just be talking too loudly? But every night, like clockwork, the whispers would return. They weren't random anymore. They were deliberate, urgent, filled with tension, and I couldn't ignore them. Something in my gut told me it was more than just noise. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight, convinced that the mystery of these voices had to be solved. I had to know if I was going crazy or if something else was really happening. I tiptoed through the apartment, heart pounding in my chest as the silence enveloped me, almost mocking my paranoia. I pressed my ear against the wall closest to the neighbor's unit, the one where the sounds seemed to come from. Nothing. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, holding my breath, listening. But there was nothing. No whispers, no argument. Just the faint hum of the fridge, the creak of the floor under my feet. For a brief moment, I thought it had all been in my head. I was about to turn and walk away when I heard it, a sudden sharp bang against the wall. My heart skipped a beat. The sound was so loud, so violent, I stumbled back, almost knocking the flashlight from my hand. The sharpness of it made my skin crawl. It was as if someone had slammed their fist into the wall. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the empty hallway. And then, the whispers began again. Only this time, they weren't whispers. They were screams. The screams pierced through the wall, raw and frantic, and I felt every nerve in my body tighten. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My legs felt like they were made of jelly as I stumbled backward, pressing myself against the opposite wall, trying to make sense of what was happening. The voices were clear now, so close that I thought I could almost feel them in the air, vibrating the walls around me. I could hear the desperation in their words, the pleading. One voice, a woman's, cracked with terror. "Please, stop! I can't. I won't." And then a low, guttural response, something I couldn't fully understand, but it sounded menacing, dangerous. I stood there, paralyzed. I thought about running, about leaving the apartment right then and there, but something in me, something dark and curious, wouldn't let me go. I needed to know who or what was causing this. I pressed my ear harder to the wall, desperate for more, but the sound stopped. Silence. A silence that felt thicker than the air around me. And then, faintly, so faintly, it came again. A door creaking open. I could barely move, as if the very air had thickened around me, pressing down with an invisible weight. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat louder than the last, as the door creaked again, slowly and unnervingly. It sounded almost deliberate, like whoever was behind it was savoring the moment. I strained my ears, trying to catch any further sound, but all I could hear was the low hum of the refrigerator and the soft thrum of my own pulse. The oppressive silence stretched on, but it wasn't a relief. It was the kind of silence that makes the blood freeze in your veins, as if you're waiting for something to happen, something you can't predict but know is coming. I was so sure that something was about to reveal itself, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the door. I took a step closer, moving on instinct now, not thinking, just needing to know what was on the other side. The door, once solid and locked, now seemed to have a presence of its own, like it was alive, almost breathing. I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling so violently that it felt like they might slip right off. As my hand made contact, I froze. A sharp, dragging noise came from behind the door, a slow, deliberate scrape, like nails against wood. Then a soft, almost imperceptible voice murmured from within, "You shouldn't be here." My skin prickled, my throat tight, unable to swallow the growing lump of fear that had lodged there. My eyes darted across the room, searching for any other exit, any way to escape, but I knew I was trapped. The voice didn't belong to any person I recognized. It didn't even sound human. It was cold, detached, like the voice of something far older, far darker than anything I'd ever known. The dragging sound continued, growing louder, more frantic, as if something or someone was getting closer. I could feel my legs shaking, but I couldn't move. I was locked in place, my mind torn between running and confronting whatever was behind that door. Every instinct in me screamed to turn away, to leave this apartment and never look back, but I felt an overwhelming need to understand. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was curiosity. But before I could stop myself, I pressed the door handle down, and the door opened with a slow, almost reluctant creak. The darkness beyond was thick, suffocating. I could barely see anything at all, but the air felt wrong. It felt alive in a way I couldn't explain, like the shadows were shifting, moving on their own. And then I heard it, a low, guttural growl that vibrated the very air around me, followed by a whisper, so close I could feel the breath on my skin. "You shouldn't have listened." The growl reverberated through the walls, shaking me to my core. My breath caught in my throat, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. The door creaked open wider, and I stepped back, instinctively trying to distance myself from whatever lay on the other side. My mind screamed for me to leave, to run as far as I could and never look back. But my feet were glued to the floor, and curiosity, no, terror, compelled me forward. My flashlight flickered, casting long, twitching shadows across the walls. I swallowed hard, my heart a drumbeat in my chest. The darkness beyond the door seemed to pulse, like it was breathing, alive and waiting. Then I saw it, a glimmer of movement in the pitch-black space. Someone shifting, but not quite human. I stepped closer, every muscle in my body tensed, ready to bolt at the slightest sound, the slightest movement. As I moved further into the room, the temperature seemed to drop. My breath became visible in the air, and my fingers numbed from the cold. It was as if the room itself had become part of something unnatural. And then, from the dark corner, a figure emerged, a tall, slender shadow with sharp, angular features. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The skin was stretched too tight, the eyes too wide, glowing faintly in the dark. Its mouth opened, but it wasn't the sound of words that came from it. It was a growl, low and vibrating, like it was inside me, vibrating my bones. I stood frozen, unable to move or scream. My body betrayed me in its paralysis, as if my own fear had locked me in place. "You shouldn't have stayed," the voice rasped again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was clear, unmistakable, and filled with malice. It stepped forward, the shadows around it twisting like they were alive, as though it was pulling them along with it. The light flickered again, and in that brief, heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw something even more disturbing. A pair of eyes, human eyes, trapped in the creature's face. They were wide with terror, pleading for help, but they weren't mine. They were someone else's. I couldn't tear my gaze away from them. I wanted to scream, to run, but it felt like my very soul was being drained by the weight of its presence. Then, as if on cue, the air shifted, and the creature, if it could even be called that, leaned in closer. The smell was overpowering now, like decay, like something had been left to rot for years. "You're not supposed to know," it growled, its voice vibrating in my chest. "You're not supposed to hear." I backed away slowly, my mind screaming for me to run. But it was too late. The shadows closed in around me, pulling me toward the dark corner of the room, where I could see no light, no escape. Suddenly, everything went black. The walls seemed to swallow the light, and for a moment, I thought I was trapped forever in this suffocating darkness. But then, just as I was about to lose all sense of time, the shadows receded, and the room was empty again. The figure was gone. The whispering had stopped. But the crack in the wall was still there, the same one I had noticed before. I couldn't explain it, whether it had been real or some sort of nightmare. But one thing was clear: I would never be the same. And as I stood there, trembling in the silence, a cold realization washed over me. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. And I could never leave. The next morning, I woke up in bed, drenched in sweat. At first, I thought it was just a nightmare, but then I saw the crack in the wall. It was exactly the same as yesterday. I smiled, thinking I had just let my fears get the best of me. "Bad dream, everything's fine," I told myself. But as I poured myself a cup of coffee, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. I quickly turned, but there was nothing there. I chuckled to myself, thinking it was just my imagination. Then, just a minute later, I heard a faint whisper. "You're not alone, you know." I froze. Maybe it wasn't over after all.